Okay, so I think we should get underway. My name's Danny Alexander. I was a student at St Anne's College reading PPE between 1990 and 1993. I'm here in Beijing, now Vice President of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, having been Chief Secretary to the Treasury in the UK government between 2010 and 2015. And it's a great privilege to be asked to take part in this seminar on the global and UK economic impact of COVID-19, part of St Anne's contribution to the Oxford University Meeting Minds Global Programme and the St Anne's Alumni Reunion Weekend. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, guests, speakers, and everyone from around the world. So the format of the session will be that in a moment I'll introduce our three St Anne's alumni and expert panelists who will each kind of give us some opening remarks on the topic, and then they will, after hearing from the speakers, we'll have a chance for some discussion of the topics, and then the final 20 minutes there'll be Q&A. And so if you have questions, then please just post them in the chat box of the event as we go along, and we'll try and pick those up in the latter half of the session. So our three distinguished panelists are, firstly, Paul Donovan. Paul is the Chief Economist for UBS Global Wealth Management. Swee-Kheng Lee is the Chief Operating Officer of Infinitum Investors Group, and Alpesh Patel, Dealmaker for the Department for International Trade. And so I want to ask the panelists to both introduce themselves and say something about their St Anne's background, and then each to give a kind of short overview of what you believe to be the key impacts on the economies of the UK and the world, both now and the impacts in the future as a result of the global COVID-19 pandemic. So first, I would like to ask Paul to give his remarks. Paul, over to you.
Thanks very much, Danny, and hello, everybody. As you heard, I'm Paul Donovan, the Chief Economist at UBS Global Wealth Management. I was also studying PPE at St Anne's between 1990 and 1993. Subsequently, I'm still quite involved with the college. I think I am now the longest serving member of the investment committee, which does its best with the endowment, and I sit on the development board for the college as well. With regards to the pandemic, I think that there are a lot of very interesting features about the way in which the pandemic has affected the economy, some of which are cyclical, and some of which are about accelerating the process of structural change. So I think the first point to make is that the COVID-19 pandemic is the first pandemic with a hashtag. This is the first pandemic of the global social media age. And that, I think, is particularly important because when we're looking at the economic impact of something like the pandemic, while the human impact is very naturally focused on things like mortality and the caseload, the economic impact is really about the fear of the pandemic. And the one thing we know, of course, is that social media is very good at promoting fear and at promoting fake news. Fake news is far more likely to be distributed than the truth is over social media. We've seen this from past election campaigns. So we have this very unique environment with this pandemic compared to previous pandemics that fear spreads a lot more quickly, and therefore the economic impact potentially spreads a lot more rapidly. When we look at what has happened cyclically, I think what we saw last year was not a recession. And whilst economists like to play with words a lot, and we all get obsessed with the semantics, this actually, I think, is a really important point. Because the normal recession is when you get an imbalance in the economy weakens, Policymakers come in, they tackle the imbalance, you gradually rebuild confidence, and you gradually get a recovery. And it's a set sort of pattern, and it can take longer or shorter periods of time depending on the competence of the policymakers, but we know the pattern. But that's not what happened last year. I would argue that 2020 was more or less an extended global version of France's Grand Vacances. People stopped working, people started working again. It's a very binary process. And that throws up an immediate problem, because what we have seen, particularly in the first half of this year and at the tail end of last year, is the financial markets, and I think policymakers and statisticians have all been trying to squeeze the narrative of the pandemic into a classic recession recovery cycle, because that's what you've got the models for. And of course, it just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit this narrative at all. So one example, which I think is very, very telling. Since August of 2020, in most major economies for which we have data, there has been an absolute explosion of business creation. The number of business startups has been growing 20, 30%. I mean, it's astonishingly strong in the US and the UK, Singapore, Japan, France, Germany. Very, very strong business creation. So much so that even with the pandemic, we have more businesses in existence today than we had at the start of 2020. Now, clearly, in a recession, you do not expect to emerge from a recession with more businesses operating than you started with. So this is clearly telling us that we're not dealing with the classic recession recovery cycle. The other thing cyclically, I think, that has come out of this whole process is a very clear demonstration of the limits to economic data. That we've seen, not that the economic data is showing bad numbers, that was inevitable, but that the quality of the data just can't be trusted. And in recent years, there has been this sort of almost religious belief that economic numbers are accurate. And most economic numbers are just the wildest of guesses most of the time. And in fact, the quality has deteriorated in recent years. And because most data is survey-based and survey evidence is becoming less and less reliable, the official numbers, GDP, inflation, I mean, these were just rough estimates for most of the last 12 months. Things like business sentiment surveys were completely wrong. I mean, catastrophically wrong over the course of last year in predicting what was going on. And what has happened is, I think, that in trying to understand the economy, it has been made very obvious we really need to improve the quality of the data we've got, but also try and broaden the range of sources that we use. The Office of National Statistics in the UK, I think, has actually done a reasonably good job of this in trying to broaden out the data. Financial markets have been latching onto things like Google mobility data because it's very important. All of that is the cyclical story, but I think actually when we look back in 10 years' time at the experience of the pandemic, it is actually going to be the structural acceleration that is the key story that is going to matter. We've already started to emerge on the fourth industrial revolution: automation, robotics, digitization, social media, etc. And this was always going to have some very, very profound changes in the global economy. It means, I think, that globalization is in reverse, which is actually a good thing because it will be more efficient provided it's done correctly, with localization of production. Home working is changing the way the patterns of work in the economy, changing employment participation. Online retail, for example, again, another shift that we're seeing. So we're seeing some fairly profound changes. And the thing about the fourth industrial revolution, although a lot of people get excited about the technology, as an economist, I do not get excited about technology. I was still using a BlackBerry 2 years ago, for goodness sake. Technology is not my thing. What I get excited about is the use of technology. And that's what the pandemic has done. It has changed how we use technology, and by doing so, it has accelerated structural change. So 4 years ago, I bought a new laptop. That didn't change the economy. 18 months ago, I started using that laptop to work from home. And that immediately changes transport demand. I'm no longer commuting to the office. Changes real estate demand. My employer doesn't need so much office space anymore. It changes investment spending. My employer is not providing me with the desk, the computer equipment to do my job. I'm providing it out of consumer spending rather than out of investment. It changes food demand. I'm no longer buying an overpriced sandwich in the City of London. I'm making a cheese and pickle sandwich in my kitchen every lunchtime. So you're making these dramatic changes, not because 4 years ago I bought a laptop, but because the pandemic forced me to change how I use that laptop. And that's where things, I think, become very significant. I would argue we are accelerating structural change. Now, that is good because I think the structural change is going to make us more efficient, but it is also a negative because the structural change happens so quickly, it becomes more difficult to provide support to those who are being left behind by this process of structural change. And so the potential for inequality, for what economists so charmingly call frictional unemployment, which is actually a really serious problem, these problems are being magnified by the very rapid pace of structural change the pandemic has brought about. I'll leave it there.
Well, thanks very much indeed, and we'll look forward to trying the cheese and pickle sandwich at some point in the future. Next, and we'll come back to many of the issues that you've raised, I'm sure, especially the structural ones. Next, I'd like to invite Swee. Please, look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Swee. I matriculated in St. Anne's in 1978, also to do PPE, and left there with a DPhil. I have worked with the central bank as an economist and the World Bank, and was a fund manager for over 25 years investing in Asia Pacific and emerging market equities. I recently left the city and am now the operating officer of a small young company, Infinitum. Today, I would like to share some thoughts on how the pandemic is affecting the economic ism of internationalism, nationalism, and regionalism in three different ways. The first arises because of the massive disruption to global supply chains. And with a lingering pandemic, we can see ourselves, businesses and consumers continue to face unpredictable disruptions for some time. Such economic nationalism would also support and be supported by the very many nationalistic political moves, such as Trump's policy of taking back control. I think the major questions arising in this context is whether economic internationalization has now peaked, and if so, what does it mean for economic production and therefore trade? At the extreme, you could envisage a move to very short local supply chain. So each country would operate as a very close economy. The industries which would move first would be those which has high disruption costs, both financially and strategically. And obviously, the government support would be affected too. It is, however, inconceivable that in today's modern complex world, that such closed economies on a national basis will be able to satisfy the diversity in business and consumer needs at acceptable prices. And therefore, this leads to the second effects on COVID, namely that maybe regional blocks may be a solution because they deliver shorter supply chains while offering a diversity of goods and services. We already are seeing a nascent tripolar world dominated by three sizable regional blocks. So in one corner, we have the new RCEP, established in the summer of 2020 in Beijing, led by China, which essentially eclipsed the Pacific Rim TPP. In the other corners, we have the EU and NAFTA, now called I think it's the USMCA. And dotted around the world, we've got several various economic groupings, often with overlapping memberships. The success of a trading bloc depends on the market size and the diversity of its production based among its members. It also depends on whether there exists a dominant member, and whether the dominant member is willing to sacrifice sovereignty and to forego some immediate economic benefits for the greater good. If it is not willing to do so, then it's a facade for economic nationalism. So what does it mean for all of us as consumers? Well, while regionalism offers shorter some scale and some diversity and comparative advantage, neither will exceed the benefits that's being offered in a global context. So simply put, we will have to face higher prices and with a limited set of choice. Finally, I want to highlight the two opposing effects of the pandemic on internationalism. On one hand, the pandemic has advanced cooperation in vaccine production and distribution. On the other hand, vaccine nationalism has been used directly to promote economic and political interests. It is also striking that the necessary medical solution to COVID is exactly equivalent to the environmental solution to climate change, so that global solutions can only work and national responses are totally insufficient. I shall now end with just some unsurprising comments that the COVID has affected the world in multiple complex ways, and there are no straightforward, simple answers, and that whatever economic effects cannot be seen in isolation. Politics has to matter somewhat. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Swee. Thank you for those thoughtful remarks and for bringing it into the more, also into the more global context. Lastly, I'm delighted to invite Alpesh to make some opening remarks. Alpesh, look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Danny. Well, I matriculated in 1993, which sort of, although I don't look it, makes me the baby of the, well, this virtual tutorial that we're having. And the highlight of my time at St. Anne's, and I read PPE, was being a congressional intern. And I think I pretty much peaked in terms of the importance of the work I did when I was there, and it's been sort of downhill ever since. Nevertheless, I will explain to you in terms of the two main roles that I have, how I see COVID having impacted the UK. So I have two main roles. When I was at Oxford, we were told, I remember in one economics lecture, we were told, look, you've got the privilege of being taught by Nobel laureates. You've got one-to-one tutorials or two-to-one, and you'll never be surrounded by such a privileged group of people, such privileged education that you'll have. Whatever you do, don't go to the city and shuffle paper. So obviously what I did is I shuffled paper 10 years later. I set up an asset management company. The more important aspect of that asset management business, the hedge fund and the private equity side, is the areas that concern me the most relate to gender and racial wealth divides. Mm-hmm. And what I fear is that the impact of COVID will widen that gap. Let me just give you some data. It said that according to Bank of England figures, 1.5 trillion pounds of cash is stored in savings accounts, including ISAs and the like. That's equal to the value of all UK residential mortgages. So there's a fear that not only, as we know, that people, there's a gender and a race gap. In other words, ethnic minorities and women earn less compared to men for the same work, but that division might increase during this period, because if you're stagnant with your savings and you've got fewer savings, you're going to grow at a lower rate. Fidelity International showed that 42% of women in the UK did not know how much they had saved for retirement. In comparison, only 1 in 4 men were unable to confirm their retirement funds. This is particularly important, not just because of the social issues, not just because asset management in and of itself is pointless. It's what you can do with the capital, and also because of St. Anne's heritage as a women-only college. And these are issues which are particularly important to the college as well. So my concerns are, has this worsened? This becomes particularly concerning when you consider a recent survey from Brewin Dolphin, which found that 94% of the employees they surveyed found that their finances caused them financial stress, caused them stress. 36%, almost, well, over 1 in 3, said financial worries impact their sleep. So we've got this link between financial stress, gender and wealth division, and mental health. Of employees saying they have financial stress, they were 15 times more likely to have sleepless nights, more troubled relationships, and here's one for the Economist, more sick days. Okay, so there's a direct linkage we can see. Now, what has COVID, what's the impact been? Well, perversely, and it's come as a surprise to me, probably not to Paul, but certainly to me, the US stock markets are all-time highs. I did not expect that. You might say, well, you're in asset management. Surely you're supposed to, with your crystal ball, foresee that. No, we did not. All-time highs in the US. Guess where your pension's invested? So those with more capital get to accelerate ahead, especially if they're financially literate enough to know that their SIPs and ISAs in which their pensions are invested can invest in those equities. What worries me is, as we know, most Britons have their money invested almost entirely in UK equities through funds and so on. And the UK markets are at 1999 levels, pretty much. So what we see is, again, financial literacy will almost certainly lead to, put it in crude terms, the rich getting richer, okay? Separately to all of this, and I can touch upon more of the points later on, I have my government role. And my government role started about 15 years ago, where the UK government approached entrepreneurs, business people such as myself, and it was exactly the same time I set up the asset management business, and they said, will you help us find outstanding technology companies from around the world and bring them over here? So that title you mentioned, Danny, Dealmaker, believe it or not, it actually is. Can you believe it? Before, it does exist. And before Donald Trump became president, I might have been the only deal maker in government in the UK or the US, but my role is to do the deals to bring those technology companies, outstanding, innovative technology companies, their global headquarters to the UK. It's part of the global entrepreneur program within the Department for International Trade. I cover China, I cover Southeast Asia and India. There's been roughly on average only a team of 15 of us, and over the last 15 years, we've brought in about $1 billion of increase in market cap, the valuation of the companies from when they landed in the UK, their global headquarters, to the point they were audited, independently audited, not by the department, by, I think it was E&Y initially. The problem COVID brought is, well, wait a minute, there's uncertainty and there's no travel. Are we going to be able to bring that inward investment into the UK, increase our intellectual property gene pool? That's why the UK government set up the program 15 odd years ago, because we know intellectual property is directly correlated to the GDP of a country. What will happen as a result of COVID? So to give you a micro example, surprisingly, and again, you might say, Alpesh, you need to polish your crystal balls. I was expecting us to fall off a cliff. No travel, uncertainty. Actually, what we're seeing is from countries like Turkey, India, Singapore, a doubling up of our pipeline. We recently launched a fintech competition with some of the leading VCs in the UK, Amadeus, Founders Factory, Octopus, Episode 1. These are the people who've invested in the kinds of unicorns. Well, actually, they weren't unicorns. They were small companies initially have become unicorns. The kinds of companies who want coming to the UK and then becoming unicorns in the UK. And that's why that government program exists. So companies like Wise, Zoopla, Shazam, Betfair, Moneybox, Seedcampy, Toro Monies, and these types, Stripe, Tide, Deliveroo. That competition has led to a doubling up of our pipeline. Now we have, I'm sure, Danny, when you were at Treasury, you probably knew about this database that the UK government has of all inward investment projects anywhere in the world. And we see that in our small unit, we've seen a doubling in our global entrepreneur program, a doubling of the pipeline. Now that comes as a shock. I would have expected that not to happen. So as with people, I wonder if with countries, during times of these kind of crises like COVID, the rich get richer. Richer countries like ours are getting more companies from countries like India, like Turkey, coming over here. And the key reasons they give, other than skills and the kinds of things which, Danny, when you were in government, you would have talked about with the UK, actually ease of doing business. And that really comes to the fore during something like COVID. So maybe I shouldn't have been surprised that there'd be more coming over here. So that, in a way, a worry, but a benefit, but still leads to there's still a bigger global problem with that. So I'll just end with that thought. There have been some positives, but there's still gaps which are very worrying.
Thanks very much, Alpesh. And I wanted to just pick up on where you left off, which is in a way about some of the unequal outcomes that are being seen in many different ways. So I'm sitting here in Beijing. I'm now Vice President for Policy and Strategy of a multilateral development bank, the AIB. So our focus is on particularly what is the experience of low and middle income countries in Asia, the countries who are our clients, and who we've been trying to support both with the financing of the immediate needs in response to the pandemic, but then also as many of those countries start hopefully to get into a recovery phase, then what are the areas of investment that they will need help with. And I think your story about divergence is one that you see on a global scale. If you look at the impact on GDP in the short term, but also if you look at the vaccine availability, if you look at the likely timescales before vaccines can reach a sufficient proportion of the population to have a material effect on disease, and then you see a huge divergence between the developed and the developing world. We've been financing vaccine procurement, some vaccine manufacturing, as well as just immediate budget support for some of our lower income members who need that at this stage. And I think so you talked about it from the perspective of the rich getting richer, let's say within the UK or within the US or within Europe. But I think that, in this pandemic, we've also seen, for the first year for many years, last year, the number of people in the world living in absolute poverty increasing. Because, if you're in the UK and you're in salaried employment and the government is supporting your wages through this period, then although the experience is awful, very stressful, very difficult, it's completely different to if you're in India, let's say, only 20% of the population receive salaries. Most people are living more day by day, and so the capacity of the government to give you that kind of support is completely different, and so the experience is completely different. And I think that at the same time, some of the mega trends or the macro issues that Paul talked about, as we're seeing accelerated, you're seeing that all over the world, I think. So it's very noteworthy looking around Asia. Those societies with highly developed digital infrastructure have been much more capable of responding quickly and flexibly, of sharing information with their people, of putting in place systems to track and trace. I know a sore spot in the UK, but nonetheless, those kind of systems have been very, very important for the ability to manage the impact. But you see also huge digital divides in Asia, low-income countries, particularly, that don't have the digital infrastructure necessary to be able to benefit from that. That's one example. And so I think that Swee's point about the kind of international dimension to this crisis is another kind of one of the contradictions. You see at the same time these very severe effects, but also I think if one compares it to the 2008 crisis, and then at the time I was in government, 2010, 2015, where we were trying to deal with the consequences of that. In that period, there was a very high level of international cooperation to deal with many of the consequences. And I think that's been much more difficult this time around for lots of reasons. And so, although there have been good efforts made by many developed countries, for example, to support vaccines for the developing world, nonetheless, that hasn't gone as quickly or as effectively as I think most people from a development perspective would like to see. So I think the impact on the global economy is very mixed, and one of the things that we will have to work on is how can we make sure that resources go and support goes to these low-income countries that are clearly suffering the most and are likely to have the most prolonged and profound effect, and where the experience of the economic effects of the pandemic isn't the kind of what Paul described, which was basically, putting the economy into suspended animation for a little while, and then hopefully picking it up again whole and restarting it, but where the damage potentially is much deeper. So I just wanted to add that perspective, abusing my position as chair to share a few thoughts from here. But as it's a topic that you all talked about, I want to go back to this issue of inclusion, of how and what the right measures are to try and ensure that the recovery and the response is an inclusive one. Paul, I said I would plug your book, although I'm not going to plug it by name, but you've written recently on the question of prejudice and the I'm doing this because the royalties go to the college, incidentally. But where the you've written about the negative economic consequences of prejudice, and Swee talked about some of the ways in which we've seen prejudice grow during this period. How do you see the pandemic in that context, Paul? First,
I believe that whenever you get structural change, unfortunately, you will also get prejudice. Now, what makes it particularly damaging, and prejudice is always damaging, what makes it particularly damaging now is that we really, really, really need the right person in the right job at the right time. And if you're going to say, you're brilliant, you're just the right person, but I don't want to work with women, or I don't like people with red hair, so I'm not going to employ you. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is. Any kind of irrational prejudice is going to undermine the efficiencies of the fourth industrial revolution. Now, my worry is that whenever you get periods of complex structural change, some people find their status, their income, etc., going up, and some will find it going down. That is unfortunately inevitable. We can try and mitigate the damage, but that is what's going to happen. And it becomes very easy for people who are losing their jobs to say, well, it's not my fault I'm losing my job. And on the surface, it's not. They're doing their job to the best of their ability. They've always done a good job. It's just the universe has moved on and their job is no longer particularly relevant. But they tend not to understand the complex economic forces. So the instinct to say it's not my fault I'm losing my job, that immigrant has stolen it. So to Swee's point about a lot of Trump's take back control type stuff, Make America Great Again is a fantastic example of restorative nostalgia. Because what Make America Great Again means is it's not your fault you lost the job, it's illegal immigrants coming in, stealing your job, vote for me, we'll build a wall, we'll keep them out, and everything will go back to this mythical golden past that never actually existed. Which is quite a lot to fit in a slogan on a baseball cap, but it worked. And that, of course, is now being accelerated by the change of the pandemic. So just directly because we are accelerating structural change, I think we're accelerating the risk of prejudice, and we're seeing this across the board. And to the point Alpesh was making about wealth inequality, again, I mean, wealth inequality always has a certain degree of seriousness. I actually think income inequality is more serious than wealth inequality, but wealth inequality has become more significant. And that's because the point I was making about all of these business startups, well, to start up a business, you need some kind of wealth, generally speaking. So if we are going to an environment where self-employment, business startups, entrepreneurship are becoming more significant, and I believe that we are, that wealth inequality is a problem. And that wealth inequality comes across various prejudice groups. So gender, women have to fight harder to get the same treatment as men when it comes to business loans. Race, you are less likely in America to own your own home if you're from an ethnic minority, and therefore you don't have that important asset on which to raise business capital. Sexuality, if you're a gay man in the United States, you are less likely to be given a mortgage and therefore own a home and be able to invest in business. So all of these areas are coming through, and to my mind, what we are unfortunately doing is simultaneously increasing the risk of prejudice and increasing the economic cost of prejudice. And that, for me, is the number one priority over the next few years, trying to create an economic climate where prejudice is not abolished. I'm not naive enough to think that, but at least contained.
And Alpesh, I want to come back to you first on this topic because you also raised it, and from, I mean, your work in financial markets and elsewhere in the UK, but also beyond. I mean, do you see any trends that could be built upon that are running against the tide that Paul describes?
Yes, and there's always a danger that I take a small sample size of personal experience and then, of course, extrapolate it. So putting that caveat to one side and sort of biases of the lens through which I might look at things and things that cross my desk. During COVID, we saw, of course, Black Lives Matter and that acceleration towards that focus on race. And probably for the first time in the last 15 years, I saw sort of government come together in the UK, including in the Department for International Trade, the department that I have the most experience with, and in asset management, where we said, right, how do we, what do we do and how do we make things better? And that was because of what was happening in the US, and then in the UK, there was a focus to it. And those kinds of things don't tend to happen that often. I'm trying to think in the last 20 years when sort of race had that much of an impact in the last 20 years that we started dealing with it across from government and in a sphere that I'm working in. So that's a slight positive. We're seeing changes, and now that it had been raised over a year ago, and it sort of reached its crescendo almost. It's the work still going on. It's not as if people have, it wasn't a fad from what I can see, and that's good as well. So both in asset management, both in finance and gender issues in finance and race. In other words, there aren't many people who look like me who are running asset management companies in the UK. That's part of it, or disproportionately fewer than there would be given our composition in the economy. That's not to say, certainly not to say, I'm British Indian. I'm probably from the most privileged ethnic minority there is. So that's not to say I've got the issue. But if we look at the Black population, that's really where the data shows there's a disparity. And similarly, like I said, I mean, my job with the government is, in a way, we're sort of a search party looking for immigrants, looking for talented immigrants to bring to the UK, entrepreneurs. And yes, there's been an even more acceleration towards entrepreneurship, perhaps pushed because of COVID, perhaps forced entrepreneurship, and now they're looking to come over here. What's interesting, and I don't have the data about it, is it cheaper to start a business in this age of technology than it was in my parents' generation when they needed to find money for a shop or a restaurant or whatever else? It was capital intensive. And that I don't have the data for. Is it actually perversely easier, if you're pushed into entrepreneurship, to start that business now? Anecdotally, and I'll finish with this, whilst I said I peaked when I was a congressional intern at my time at St. Anne's, actually I think my Oxford education peaked last year when Business Insider wrote a headline calling me a TikTok sensation. That's when I knew my Oxford education was worth it. And on TikTok, I see people in their early 20s more and more looking at entrepreneurship, and hopefully that'll be a route out from conventional routes which might be less open to them because of lack of finance.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Now, I'm going to go to some of the questions in a moment, but Swee, I wanted to come back to you first because to follow on from this, you, in your remarks, you talked about internationalism and the international environment. I mean, I think one of the things we can also see is that dealing with this hugely severe crisis around the world has also had the effect of focusing attention even more on how to prevent or manage crises, and especially to thinking about how to deal with the challenge of climate change. UK is hosting the COP26 meeting later this year, and commitments to net zero and to various policy changes that can help to both reduce emissions and deal with and adapt to the harmful effects of the climate change that we've already seen are coming forward more. This seems to be one of the areas where international cooperation has the capacity really to make a difference. I work for an international institution, and we're planning that more than half of our finance will be climate finance by 2025, for example. And I just wonder if you could maybe situate that issue in the context of the pandemic and how you see potentially the capacity to deepen international cooperation in that area?
I mean, that is a very interesting point because, it is, it's also, it's the opposing effect of the pandemic, isn't it? Sort of bringing much more cooperation. I mean, for a fact that we know that China actually came out with very clear objectives of when they would go to carbon neutral. And also then you also see in Europe where the ECB has started, selling and buying green bonds to help in the recovery fund. So it is heartening to see that there is some underlying force, which all of us are increasingly worried about. And maybe through these sort of, you might say, well, it is related to the economics of the world, but you could almost say it's in the old-fashioned way, it's one of the externalities, which is now coming to the forefront in very much the same way as what Alpesh has said about Black Lives Matters in, the underlying social concern, putting pressure on governments to act.
Thank you. So we've got quite a few questions. So I want to address some of the questions. There's questions about some of the consequences of the pandemic. There are a few questions that look like they're looking for stock market advice and investment tips. We may come back to that before the end. So one of the questions, though, perhaps Paul, I'll come back to you, is the question is asking. We talk about growing inequality and especially wealth inequality, asset price inflation, but isn't really the guilty party QE and monetary policy since about 2009 rather than the pandemic? And aren't we kind of guilty of blaming longer term problems or longer term structural issues on just what happens to be happening at the moment? How do you see that one?
So it's sort of, I mean, undoubtedly quantitative policy has had an impact on asset prices. What we have to dispel, I think, is the idea that money is printed and it goes into the equity market. That absolutely did not happen. We know that. We know where the money went. The money went under people's mattresses. So what we had last year was an extraordinary increase in demand for cash in developed economies, because people were saving, because they were forced to save. You had no alternative but to save money in developed markets. Now, there is only one legal supplier of cash in an economy, which is the central bank. So what you get is that increase in demand for cash met by an increase in supply for cash. So to that extent, printing money has not gone into equity markets. However, the way that governments inject liquidity into the system is by buying less liquid assets, government bonds, so you're forcing down government bond yields, making government bonds less attractive to earn, and therefore you are pushing people into equities. So if I think about the college is endowment. I'm not giving away any secrets here. We have an income requirement. It's all very well saying, well, we can go to the economics fellow and explain that because returns are lower, they're going to have to take a pay cut. The economics fellow suddenly stops acting like a rational economist if you tell them they've got to take a pay cut because returns are lower. We have an income requirement. We can't get that income on government bonds. When I started on the investment committee, the majority of the college's portfolio was in bonds because we got a nice high interest rate. We can't do that anymore. We'd go bust if we went into government bonds. So we go into a more diverse range of assets. And that action has then led to strength in those markets. So I think that there is an element to which this is the case. Now, the income that the college is getting, the percentage income on our portfolio, isn't necessarily changing that much. So our spending power isn't changing, but the wealth is. And that's the difference between income inequality, which hasn't risen as much as wealth inequality, which has risen more. It's not directly because we're printing money, but it's an indirect side effect of what is going on. And it's a problem, but it's just part of this bigger picture of structural change where a lot of people's incomes are also being affected.
Thank you very much. So we do have a few questions. I mean, not surprisingly, given we've got three financial market experts on the panel about investment opportunities. Swee, maybe I could come to you. One of the questions asks, where would you see the biggest investment opportunities in the next 5 years? Another asks, which global technology companies are going to change the world in the coming years? I know that you look at the opportunities around the world. So interested, maybe not to give stock picking tips, but more to say, what are the trends? Where do you see investment returns in the future?
Well, as a pensioner, being the oldest member of the college in this panel, the equity markets, I think Paul would agree with me, worries me in that it is highly valued at the moment with all the liquidity running around, and also with a lot of much more regulatory things coming up from various governments on a number of the key sectors, particularly the technology sectors, and that sector which has brought the markets actually to all-time high. I do believe that now, and maybe it sounds like as if I'm supporting what I'm doing at the moment, is that the area which would bring, I think, the biggest return would be the unlisted sector, which is in private equity. But then again, that is very speculative, and unfortunately, this would be an opportunity only for the much more wealthy ones, because they would have access to into the infrastructure of investing in it. I mean, for example, the company I work with, Infinitum, is actually a Korean company, and its aim is to bring globally companies with global age in technology and innovations to the marketplace to raise capital. Like, for example, I have been meeting biomedical companies which helps with respiration and with cancer diseases, and which can be done at a very efficient and very cost-effective way. So, I mean, I'm sure Korean is not the only one which provides this, but although it is a center of innovation. But so anyway, to put it very shortly, yes, I would be very wary of the listed markets. For the wealthy, it would be private equity, but again, you have to have a portfolio of that, because 1 out of 10, if it's successful, that would be great. And I would also add that one last possibility of investment, as suggested by my son, is cryptocurrency, which is something I just cannot understand. So I wouldn't touch it at all. I don't know whether that's helpful, but
It's certainly very interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Margaret Cottonot had a question. She says, on the other hand, COVID plus climate change has been the origin of successful experimentation in certain fields. She gives the example of lavender native from France being planted in Jammu, India. Tea from India has been planted in Brittany. Now, I think one can also say that one of the, and to be here with an Oxford University group, I think we should particularly celebrate it, but the way pandemic has demonstrated what our scientists can do, and the pace of scientific innovation, and the quality of scientific innovation, and in this case, the great role that Oxford University, among many other institutions, has played is also something to be celebrated. But Alpesh, do you have other success stories that you've seen building up in this period?
Yeah, I mean, picking up from your last point, I was at dinner at college many years ago, and I said, surely Oxford is not about creating more accountants, more lawyers, more auditors, no offense to those professions, but to use the sort of the motto of another university, what starts here changes the world. Surely that and the vaccine shows it, but surely that's what we want of our students, future students, and hopefully can inspire others to think the same way. Within government, within the program that I'm part of, so go back to that and where I think the world will change. Our remit, and I forgot to mention earlier, is to bring technologies here which will change the world, solve the world's biggest problems. The UK government isn't, looking to attract these companies just because they want another gaming technology, welcome though they are if they employ lots of people, but it is technologies which will change the world. So at that end, I deal with companies which, for instance, we took an air purification technology out of NASA and we headquartered it here, and now it provides air purifiers from everything from buildings to hospitals around the world to cars even, and you can imagine in COVID that's important. Now that becomes a British company. Those kind of technologies are not ones you can directly invest in, even as an angel. If they're not open to angel investing, we have blockchain companies like there's a company called Worldwide Generation that we brought to the UK. And what it does is make sure money from governments or NGOs, so something which will be of particular concern actually to everybody on this, goes to where it's supposed to. And they use blockchain technology to make sure did the money actually get there. And there's many others like this, which are saving lives, improving quality of life. However, I can't necessarily invest in those, nor as an angel investor would I want to, because I don't want my capital locked up for 10 years, or I wouldn't have enough capital to spread widely enough because of, as Swee said, the probabilities of success. So in the end, I go to the listed markets because it's the area I know most about. And the thing that I love the most is I was lucky enough to be at a lunch with the then chairman of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, and they talked about some of the research they'd done on formulas of what works in investing. And they came up with something they'd stolen from Deutsche Bank. I'm sure they won't sue me for saying that, which was a cash flow based indicator. And I tend to go back to companies which are generating the most cash flow. So I'm not going to try and gamble on the next crypto, I'm afraid, because the odds just don't work in my favor. The volatility will be too great. The risk is too great. I end up with high cash flow generating companies because we know the data shows they're the ones which will actually give us, for the risk we're taking, the greatest return. So nothing innovative there, which is probably just as well, because I don't think I want to give a stock pick and then 3 years later somebody say, well, it was that Oxford bloody webinar I went to. But actually, I tend to go towards the more conventional listed companies for that reason, for the risk reward side of things.
Thank you very much. So we've got 5 minutes left. There's a question here which I would like everyone to have a go at just briefly answering. The questioner says, as a student at St Anne's, it is really inspiring to hear more about what St Anne's alumni are doing and the impact you're having globally. As alumni, what would you say to me and to my fellow students who have been having a tough time during the pandemic? So Paul, would you like to start with that one?
So I would say I am concerned that the pandemic has affected the education experience of a generation, and it's something that the development board and in fact the investment committee has talked about in trying to make sure that the experience at St Anne's is the best it can possibly be in the circumstances. I would make, I think, a couple of points. The first is that don't get too concerned about disrupted education for a year or two. From my advanced age, education is something which continues afterwards. The skills that you are learning at St Anne's are going to be able to educate you for years to come, because those skills will allow you to educate yourself after you graduate. And the second thing is, remember the alumni network. You reach out to the alumni if you want help, if you want advice, if you want a conversation. For goodness sake, drop me a message via LinkedIn or whatever. I'm always happy to have a conversation with a member of the alumni, as a member of the alumni with current students. And I think a lot of the alumni are. There is a support network there. And I think now more than ever before, that support network is going to be important for the current generation of students.
Thanks very much. I'm sure I'm sure there'll be some of our listeners who will pick up on that very kind offer. Alpesh, how about you? What would you say to the current students who?
I'd repeat Paul's offer, and please do connect to Paul and me, of course, as well. It did sort of crackle a bit, and I thought when he said alumni, he said Illuminati, and I thought that all those rumors about Oxford are just going to spread even more so. But do please, yeah, absolutely. I'm sure I speak for others as well on that. What I would say to those who are finding it tough is is this: make sure that there is nobody more worthy than you for that place you've got and the privilege that you have. There are kids out there, and I know this because that's what inspired me when I was at Oxford, when I visited India on summer vacations, who at 10 p.m. at night under a flickering light bulb would give their right arms to have the place that I had at college. So I'd say that mental resilience, and draw inspiration from those who have it a hell of a lot tougher. Whenever I think to myself that I'm feeling a bit down, life's a bit hard, I try not to think how far I am from the ceiling that I want to reach, but how far I am off the floor. And instantly I feel more energized. And that's what I'd say to our students. And just remember, you've got a blank sheet of paper to make the world a better place. Please don't, as they told me at Oxford, don't just go into a career shuffling paper. Or if you do, make sure it's paper that creates wealth that can help change the world and do good things with it.
Very much. Swee, can I put the same question to you?
And I would say, you know, when you are young, 1 year would seem a lifetime. But remember, I think one should remember that really the best of your years are yet to come when you're 30 and in the 40s, by my experience. I would encourage, I would say, keep your spirits up. And St. Anne's, I know, I've been reading what they've been doing. They've been magnificent in giving support. And as both Paul and Alpesh says, the alumni community is here to help. And in the meantime, you know, make use of your time at Oxford.
Thank you very much. So I would just add to that. Three good messages there, but I'd say, you know, you're not alone. People all around the world are going through the same challenges, the same issues that you're facing, but from very different starting points, as Alpesh said. Secondly, I'd say think global. Think about the opportunities that are going to come in the next few years. In the next 2 decades, as I think this panel has talked about, are going to be a time of profound change economically and in other ways, driven by the activity that's necessary to tackle climate change, which is just an enormous transformation in the way we live our lives, the sorts of things we invest in, the way that we share our ideas and experiences, the profound change that technology is having. Not only Paul's laptop, but you know, across every aspect of our lives. And there are opportunities. There will be opportunities for you know, well-educated, driven young people who are among whom I'm sure our questioner would be one, who are willing to think about how to use their talents in education for good. So I hope if this webinar has done nothing else, it's helped to show that for you know, 4 of us who went before you in St. Anne's, we've ended up in very different walks of life, but all contributing in different ways. So I just want to finish by saying, firstly, thank you to the panel. Thanks to Paul Donovan, Alpesh Patel, and Swee-Kheng Lee for your contributions, for sharing your thoughts and ideas with our audience. Thanks to St. Anne's for organising this, and obviously there are more events forthcoming. Go and take a look at the college website, stannes.ox.ac.uk, if you want to have more details. And thanks most importantly to all of the audience who have been here today. Hope you found this to be interesting. I hope you found it was worth an hour of your time to listen to us. And thank you very much indeed for those who asked questions, and look forward to the next time. Thank you very much indeed.